My name is Mylan Rakich, and I first met Michi at Portland State University I was a student there back in 2000, and I worked with him on and off. He's one of the professors there, and I worked with him on and off. I got to really know him after I graduated. I was lucky enough to be able to work with him at his studio for quite a while. It was quite a few years. But working with Michi was really nice because he really had this idea of discipline and this daily working of art, which I really enjoyed. And all the technical things that went with stone carving, or he did do some metal work at that time earlier on. But that's what I really got from it as far as the art discipline, just that regular daily routine of art making. But overall, I actually enjoyed making lunch with him or for him and sitting down with a couple other people that worked with him. And we just had a great time talking art, talking about school and things like that. That's what I really enjoyed about Michi.
My name is Susan Agre-Kippenhan, and I knew Michi because I was at Portland State for 10 years, and I met Michi in the mid-90s. I think about him often because one thing I loved about Michi was that he was who he was in whatever he did. He was a duty and honor at the core, yet he was always curious. And he told me many, many years ago that he could never have stayed in Japan because he just couldn't do every rule expected of him. He needed to take off his shoes and be running outside, and coming to the United States had given him that freedom. In his later years at Portland State, he became the department chair, and he told me that he led by wandering. So Michi was rarely sitting at his desk, but sort of poking his nose and walking about. I remember that instead of sort of a strict, assignment or schedule book for when you could meet with Michi, he just kept an open book on the counter, and you could sign up whenever you wanted to see him. And I've gone on in higher ed to take on leadership roles, and I often think about how Michi was just the person he always was. And while I never could be like Michi, it reminded me that we should do everything with that kind of honor in our lives and be those complete kind of people. And so I think of him often, and I'm glad I'm getting a minute to talk about him. I miss him.
There are a few works of sculpture that stay with me. One of the sculptures I've admired in my lifetime was Michi's carved trussed stone form at his studio. I remember the pressure of the ropes and how the stone relents under the strain. Michi stays with me even though he's no longer here. I was lucky to have been able to visit with him whenever I was in town. We had coffee at his studio, store-bought, canned. We laughed about the high cost of fashionable coffee and fashionable trends. He was interested in the classics. We always had 2 cups. He had a smoke, we talked tools and materials and the quality of the day. We shook hands, said goodbye, and he went back to work, and I went back to work.
I knew Michi, basically I was his assistant for 10 years, starting in 2007, when I was a student at Portland State. And I just so happened to be lucky enough to be one of his graduate student, Mylan, was my teacher. And he just came up to me one day and said, "Hey, are you interested in working for an artist?" And I thought, hey, that sounds like a great job. So he said, yeah, Michi used to be a teacher here because he was retired by then and was looking for an assistant to help him with one of his commissions that he had got through TriMet. And so I took a stab at it and became his assistant. And it was, the rest is history, as they say. And I had no experience too with working with stone, so I just kind of felt, out of place, but never had that sense the first time I met Michi. He wasn't worried about, any of experience. He just wanted somebody that was willing to work with art and, talk about art and just kind of he just, wanted somebody to be engaged and understand that they're making work and it's not like a job, Well, one kind of cool story that, which I always appreciate about Michi's work is he always treated all of his works as children or friends. And he, I believe every show that, we would set up the gallery or the studio and we would place all the work on the pallets and whatnot. And then, I would leave throughout the, the day and come back the next morning or next couple of days. But he would leave the lights on for the artworks. And he always, would say it was kind of they have arrived or they're birthed. And so by leaving the lights on overnight, he kind of gave them, their life instead of turning the lights off. And I always thought that was kind of a cool little tidbit of info because he always treated the work as his children or his friends because he was, around it so much and put so much energy into them and, leaving the lights on for the artwork so they wouldn't feel lonely through the night. I always thought it was kind of cool. Michi was, he constantly said, be patient with yourself. He always kind of drilled that on me and because I was eager, young kid, wanting to know, wanting to do the best. And I was, I was worried, early on that I was messing up or I was is this right? Is this, he's like, oh, just be patient. Just trust yourself. He kind of gave me pointers here and there. He didn't really, he kind of let me go through the experience of learning how to work with the material and, come to my understanding instead of, him just showing me everything and just copying him, And so he was always patient with working and then moving the stone and placing it and then he was telling me this one story before I was his assistant that he had hired these two guys to help him take down the show here at the gallery, and they're strong guys and they thought they could move a couple of these big stones by themselves. And Michi's like, no, wait, I'll come back and I'll get the pallet. And he's like, oh no, we can move them. And so they're like, oh, let's move it. So they moved it and they only, got a couple of feet and they dropped the sculpture and it broke in two. And they were all freaking out. They're like, oh my God, we ruined the work. And then Michi came back and he says, I told you guys, you can't move these works. You gotta, be patient and slow and think about it. And so there was one sculpture, then it broke into two. So then he had two pieces. And so then he took both of those pieces back to the studio, worked on them, and then sold them both. So that one turned into two. And, but he didn't get angry or pissed. He just told the guys, hey, look, you can't, mess around with this stuff. It's heavy stone, So
in preparing to try to give a 2 or 3 or 4 minute chat about Michi, I realized that to memorialize him, there is so much I could say. I could talk for hours about everything we shared over 34 years. Being at the deathbed of my mother with him for a month and everything we shared during that time. And it wouldn't sum it up. All the trips we took together, and he and I were great travel companions, sharing a hotel room, all the caretaking in the last 2 years of his life, all that, all the conversations, the passion, the stories that he told me, the experiences we had. I ran across a quote from a famous poet the other day, just happened to see it. And I forget the name of the poet, who was talking about poetry and poems, that if you can explain a poem, it's not really a poem. And this notion that art and poetry, artists can talk about their work, but the work is supposed to stand on its own, because visual arts are a language, and each artist has their own language that they're expressing in their work. And words defy that. And Michi defies words. And what I came to know, especially as we bonded, as my mother was dying, we had bonded already, but there was depths of the bond that are unexplainable. And Michi had this amazing ability to convey meaning with a few words. And what he could share in a few words, it would open internally in me this whole world of meaning. And the lessons he taught me in life, he asked me the greatest question. I was going through a very difficult time. I was making a decision having to do with my family and my children. And I was frantic one night as I had come to this decision, and I wanted to explain it. We were family, and I wanted to talk to him and let him know what I was planning. And after we were in the car, we'd been out to dinner, and I was pulled up in the driveway, and so I had finished saying what I said, and Michi was so patient listening to me and putting up with me. And he asked me probably the best question that anybody in my life has ever asked me. And it was such a learning moment for myself. And a simple question was, Dylan, do you trust yourself? And in that moment, it just crystallized. Yes, I do. And he gave me that. And he taught me lessons about pain. He had his son died, and he did his whole series of empty spaces sculptures about that. When my mother died, and my sister and I and Michi each took turns taking the artwork that she left. In the house, there were huge empty spaces on the wall. And I said to him, a few months later, Michi, you've got plenty of artwork in this house. You don't need you can just rearrange it a little bit now that Maya and I have taken our pieces. And he said, no, I need to live with that. I need to live with those empty spaces on the wall. And in difficult times and throughout, and he talked about the pain, he and I talked about so much, and about the death of Takia, his son, and his feelings over time, and just the idea when things would go on, have patience in life. And he talked about it with me with his artwork, splitting the granite. You'd hammer in the steel pegs or whatever, wedges, and it would take months to split a huge piece of granite so that he could use it. And he told me about the patience in his artwork, and that time heals, and that sometimes you just have to let time go by. And the lessons that he taught in that way are in his artwork. Michi had this profound undercurrent, subconscious, and the weight and the gravitas of who he was, at the same time, the lightness of his impish sense of humor and spirit. I could tell you stories about, his sense of humor and but he had this firmness, this underscored firmness, this connection to groundedness that, as a sculptor working with stone, is a deep connection to things. And it's a profound loss to have him gone. But the life he lived was amazing, and it was lived on the foundation that he once told me, because we had this conversation about when did he lose his fear of death, and I was talking to him, we were talking about when we got on this topic somehow, and he had told me that he lost his fear of death when he was 10. My fear of death, I didn't lose until I was 26. Many people never lose their fear of death. And when he was 10, coming to this country from Japan was not traditionally what you were supposed to do, but he lived his life free and did what he wanted. And with all that groundedness, still managed to, in a way, dance through life. And that's all I can think to say. So we'll miss him.
What I was thinking about was a trip that we took together to the Seattle Art Fair on the train. So I knew he was going, and Laura was there. Laura was already in Seattle. So I got to sit next to him all the way up to Seattle, and it was kind of cool because, he was a captive audience, and so he was a heavy coffee drinker, and I think I don't know how many little styrofoam cups of coffee he went through, but sitting next to him was really interesting because he talked about his growing up in Japan and coming to the States and going to San Francisco Art Institute. And what was interesting is just talking about things that would veer off into maybe current events. I mean, this was 25, 30 years ago. So he would be talking, and all of a sudden you'd realize he's saying something really deep and serious and profound that you wouldn't have thought was going to come from him. And so it was kind of surprising to hear this, but he had his opinions that were not what you might expect, but totally in a good way. But they were more worldly and philosophical and wide. It wasn't just, very specific about a person or a policy, talking about politics. So that was a really nice thing. But, over the years, he and Laura would come to our house for dinner, and we would go to their house for dinner. There would be the annual picnics out at the ranch or the studio. And so, and then he was always here for openings. And so he would be this, he could be kidding around, but he'd always have some deep thoughts about the work or people, and he was very interesting to know.